Picture this, a lone Viking ship cutting through icy waters under the midnight sun, its dragon-headed prow aimed at unknown shores. The warriors aboard aren't just raiders. They're explorers, traders, poets, and the architects of a civilization that would shape the entire medieval world. But here's what most people don't know. The story of Norway isn't just about Vikings. It's about how a scattered collection of warring clans in one of Earth's harshest environments, transformed into a unified kingdom, survived centuries of foreign domination, and emerged as one of the world's most progressive nations. This is the hidden history of Norway, and trust me, it's nothing like what you learned in school. Let me start by taking you back, way back. We're talking about a time before Norway even existed as a concept, to a land so remote and forbidding that the Romans called it Thule, the edge of the known world. The landscape itself is almost alien. Imagine endless forests stretching into darkness, mountains that scrape the sky, and fjords that cut into the coastline like the fingers of some ancient god. For 6 months of the year, the sun barely rises. For the other 6, it barely sets. This is a place where nature doesn't just challenge human survival, it seems designed to prevent it entirely, but people came anyway. The first inhabitants arrived around 11,000 years ago, following the retreating ice sheets of the last glacial period. These weren't Vikings, they were hunter-gatherers, people who learned to read the land and see with an intimacy we can barely imagine today. They hunted reindeer, seals, and whales. They fished in waters so cold they could kill you in minutes. They made tools from stone and bone, and somehow, impossibly, they thrived. Archaeological sites along the Norwegian coast have revealed settlements that date back thousands of years, showing a continuous human presence that adapted and evolved with the changing environment. By the Bronze Age, around 3,000 years ago, something remarkable was happening. The people of what would become Norway were part of a vast trading network that stretched across Europe. Bronze artifacts found in Norwegian burial mounds contain copper from places as far away as Cyprus and tin from Cornwall. Think about that for a second. Bronze Age Scandinavians were engaging in international trade across thousands of miles of dangerous territory and treacherous seas. They were painting elaborate rock carvings showing ships, warriors, and mysterious symbols we still don't fully understand. These weren't primitive people scratching out a living in the frozen north. They were sophisticated, artistic, and connected to the wider world. But then something changed, the climate got colder, the good farming years became fewer, resources became scarce, and when resources become scarce, people fight. By the time we reach the Iron Age, the archaeological record shows increasing evidence of conflict, fortified settlements, weapon hordes, bodies buried with signs of violent death. The stage was being set for the era that would define Norway in the popular imagination forever. The Viking Age was coming. Now, before we dive into the Vikings, I need to clear something up because there's a massive misconception about who the Vikings actually were. When you hear the word Viking, you probably picture horned helmets, right? Brutal raiders burning and pillaging their way across Europe. Well, first of all, those helmets never existed. That's a 19th century invention. But more importantly, Viking wasn't an ethnicity or even a nationality. It was a job description. To go Viking meant to go raiding or trading overseas. Most people in Scandinavia during the Viking Age never went Viking at all. They were farmers, craftspeople, merchants. The ones who did go Viking, though, they changed the world. The Viking Age officially begins on June 8, 793. That's the date when Norse raiders attacked the monastery at Lindisfarne off the coast of England. The attack sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Monasteries were supposed to be sacred, untouchable, but to the Vikings, they were just rich targets full of gold, silver, and other treasures, all conveniently located near the coast. The raid on Lindisfarne was just the beginning. Over the next 3 centuries, Scandinavian warriors, traders, and settlers would spread across Europe, Asia, and even North America, leaving their mark everywhere they went. But here's the thing that gets lost in all the tales of raiding and conquest. The Vikings from Norway were different from their Swedish and Danish cousins. Geography shaped their destiny. Norway's coastline is one of the longest and most complex in the world. Those deep fjords that cut into the mountains created natural barriers, dividing the country into isolated regions where different clans and chieftains ruled their own territories. There was no central authority, no king of Norway, just a patchwork of independent rulers, some controlling just a single fjord, others dominating whole regions. This fragmentation had consequences. While the Danish Vikings were conquering England and the Swedish Vikings were establishing trade routes into Russia, the Norwegian Vikings were looking west. They headed for the islands, Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, and eventually Ireland. They established settlements, intermarried with the locals, and created a unique Norse, Gaelic culture that would persist for centuries. Some went even further. They settled Iceland, which was essentially uninhabited, creating what many historians consider the world's oldest surviving parliament, the Althing, established in 930. From Iceland, they pushed on to Greenland and eventually to North America, beating Columbus by nearly 500 years. Back in Norway itself, the political situation was chaotic. Dozens of petty kings and jarls fought constantly for dominance. Loyalty was personal, based on oaths between warriors and their leaders. There was no concept of a Norwegian nation. You were loyal to your chief, your family, your region. The idea that all these fractious territories could be united under a single ruler seemed impossible. But then came Harald Fairhair. Harald's story is the stuff of legend, and like many legends, it's hard to separate fact from fiction. According to the sagas, Harald was a minor king who fell in love with a woman named Jida. When he proposed, she rejected him, saying she wouldn't marry a king who ruled only a few districts. She'd only marry a man who was king of all Norway. Instead of taking this rejection badly, Harald made a vow. He wouldn't cut his hair or beard until he had conquered all of Norway. For 10 years, he fought campaign after campaign, battle after battle, gradually subjugating the other kings and jarls. The decisive moment came in the Battle of Hafrsfjord, probably around 872, though the exact date is disputed. Harald's fleet met a coalition of rival kings in a massive sea battle. When the fighting was done, Harald had won a crushing victory. The surviving kings either submitted to him or fled overseas, many of them to Iceland. Harald cut his hair. He became King of Norway, the first man to claim that title. But here's the critical question. Did he really unite Norway, or did he just become the most powerful of many competing rulers? The truth is probably somewhere in between. Harald's kingdom was more of a personal confederation than a centralized state. He distributed land to his supporters, demanded loyalty and tribute, but local rulers still maintained significant autonomy. When Harald died, his kingdom immediately began to fragment as his many sons fought over the inheritance. This pattern of unification followed by fragmentation would repeat itself for centuries. Norway wasn't really a stable, unified kingdom. It was more like a confederation held together by the force of personality of whoever happened to be the strongest king at any given moment. Harald's grandson, Håkon the Good, tried to introduce Christianity to Norway in the mid-10th century. He'd been raised Christian at the English court and saw conversion as a way to align Norway with the rest of Europe. But it didn't work. The Norwegian chieftains were deeply attached to their old gods Odin, Thor, Freya. They saw Christianity as a foreign imposition, a threat to their traditional way of life. Håkon had to abandon his mission to Christianize the country. He even had to participate in pagan sacrifices to maintain his support. Norway would remain pagan for another generation. The man who finally succeeded in converting Norway was Olaf Tryggvason, who became king in 995. Olaf had spent years abroad as a Viking raider, fighting in England, Ireland, and the Baltic. He converted to Christianity, probably in England, and when he seized the throne in Norway, he was absolutely fanatical about spreading his new faith. He didn't ask people to convert, he forced them, accept baptism or face torture and death. Olaf traveled through Norway with his warriors, destroying pagan temples, killing priests of the old gods, and burning anyone who refused to convert. He even threw his own mother-in-law off a cliff for practicing witchcraft. Olaf's methods were brutal, but they were also effective, at least in the short term. Norway began to convert, though many people probably just went through the motions while secretly maintaining their old beliefs. But Olaf made enemies, lots of them. In the year 1000, he was ambushed at sea by a coalition of his enemies at the Battle of Esvolda. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Olaf jumped from his ship rather than be captured. His body was never found. Norway fell under the control of the Danish and Swedish kings who had defeated him. But Olaf's work wasn't entirely undone, and 15 years later, another Olaf, Olaf Haraldsson, came to Norway to claim the throne. This Olaf was also a Christian convert who had fought as a Viking raider across Europe. He was determined to complete the Christianization of Norway that Olaf Tryggvason had started. Once again, the conversion was violent. Olaf Haraldsson used every brutal method at his disposal to force Christianity on his people. He made enemies just like his predecessor, but he also created a more centralized government, established church organization, and tried to build institutions that would outlast individual rulers. It wasn't enough. The Norwegian chieftains, tired of his heavy-handed rule, invited King Canute of Denmark to invade. Canute was the most powerful ruler in Scandinavia at the time, King of Denmark, England, and Norway all at once. Olaf was forced into exile. He fled to Russia but couldn't stay away. In 1030 he returned with an army determined to reclaim his throne. At the Battle of Stiklestad on July 29, 1030, Olaf's small force was crushed. Olaf himself was killed in the fighting. Here's where the story takes a strange turn. Olaf Haraldsson was not popular when he was alive. He was seen as a tyrant, but after his death, something remarkable happened. Stories began to spread about miracles occurring at his grave. The blind could see, the lame could walk. Water from the spring near his burial site was said to have healing properties. Within months, people were calling him Saint Olaf. Within a year, Norway had a martyr king and a patron saint. The very people who had opposed him in life now venerated him in death. Why, partly it was genuine religious belief, but it was also politics. Having a native saint, a Norwegian saint, gave the country a spiritual identity separate from Denmark and Sweden. It provided a rallying point, a symbol of Norwegian independence. Saint Olaf became more than a historical figure. He became the embodiment of Norway itself. His shrine at Nidaros, modern-day Trondheim, became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in northern Europe. Every Norwegian king for centuries was crowned there. Olaf died trying to unite Norway under Christianity and the crown. In death, he succeeded in a way he never could in life. Olaf's son, Magnus the Good, eventually became king, and under him and his successors, Norway finally began to stabilize as a Christian kingdom. The old pagan ways died out, though folk beliefs persisted in the countryside for centuries. Churches were built across the country, those distinctive wooden stave churches that still stand today, some of the finest examples of medieval architecture in Europe. Monasteries were established. Norway became part of the Catholic world, connected to Rome, participating in the broader currents of medieval European civilization. This was also the period when Norway reached its greatest territorial extent. Under kings like Harald Hardrada and later Magnus Lorminder, Norway controlled not just the Norwegian mainland but also Iceland, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man. This was a maritime empire, held together by sea routes and sustained by Norwegian naval power. Norwegian merchants traded in ports across northern Europe. Norwegian warriors served in foreign armies, most famously in the Byzantine Empire's elite Varangian Guard. But maintaining this empire was expensive. It required constant military effort, administrative capacity that Norway didn't really have, and most importantly, it required strong, capable kings. And here's the problem. Medieval succession was a nightmare. Kings had multiple sons, often by different women. There was no clear rule about who inherited. The result was constant civil wars as rival claimants fought for the throne. Brothers killed brothers, sons rebelled against fathers. The country was torn apart by internal conflicts that lasted for decades. The worst period was the Civil War era from 1130 to 1240. Over a century of near-constant warfare between rival factions, each supporting different claimants to the throne, the Baglers against the Birkebeiner, different regions supporting different kings. The country was devastated. Population declined, trade was disrupted. The church tried to mediate, but often just became another player in the power struggles. It was only when Håkon Håkonsson emerged as the clear victor in 1240 that the civil wars finally ended. Håkon's reign marked what many historians consider Norway's medieval golden age. The kingdom was at peace, trade flourished. Håkon reorganized the administration, created a more effective government, and rebuilt Norway's international prestige. He married his daughter to a Spanish prince. He sent expeditions to Greenland and commissioned the first known survey of Iceland. Under his son, Magnus Lormender, Norway got its first unified law code, replacing the patchwork of regional laws that had existed before. For a brief moment, Norway was a major European power, but it couldn't last. The problem was that Norway's power was built on shaky foundations. The country had always been underpopulated relative to its vast territory. The climate made large-scale agriculture difficult. Most people lived in small, isolated communities along the coast or in mountain valleys. There weren't big cities, no major manufacturing, limited resources for taxation. Norway's wealth came from controlling trade routes and from exporting fish, timber, and furs. When those trade patterns shifted or when Norway faced external challenges, the kingdom was vulnerable. The first major blow came in 1349. The Black Death arrived in Norway, probably brought by an English ship that docked in Bergen. The plague spread with terrifying speed through the country's small, densely packed communities. Modern estimates suggest that between 40 and 60% of Norway's population died within a few years. Entire villages were abandoned. Farms were left untended. The death toll was catastrophic. Norway never fully recovered from the Black Death. The population loss was so severe that it changed the country's social and economic structure. There weren't enough people to farm all the land. Labor became scarce and valuable. The feudal system, never as strong in Norway as in other European countries, essentially collapsed. But the population decline also meant that Norway was weaker, less able to defend its interests, more vulnerable to stronger neighbors. And Norway's neighbors were getting stronger. Denmark in particular was emerging as the dominant Scandinavian power. In 1380, a complex series of marriages and successions led to the crowns of Norway and Denmark being united under the same ruler. At first, this was supposed to be a personal union, each kingdom maintaining its own laws and institutions. But gradually, Denmark became the dominant partner. Norwegian nobles were pushed aside in favor of Danish administrators. Norwegian revenues were spent on Danish priorities. Norway was becoming a Danish province in all but name. The situation was formalized in 1397 with the Kalmar Union, which united Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single monarch. The union was supposed to be a partnership of equals, but in practice, it was dominated by Denmark. The union capital was Copenhagen. The real power rested with the Danish nobility and the church. Norwegian interests were largely ignored. Norway's Council of the Realm, which had advised Norwegian kings for centuries, was gradually sidelined. Important decisions were made in Copenhagen without Norwegian input. For Norway, the next few centuries were a period of decline and subordination. The country was becoming a backwater. The great age of Norwegian expansion was over. Iceland, Greenland, the North Atlantic islands all remained under the Norwegian crown in theory, but they were increasingly isolated and impoverished. Contact with Greenland was eventually lost entirely. The Norse colonies there disappeared sometime in the 15th century, for reasons that are still debated. Climate change, Inuit expansion, disease, economic collapse, probably all of the above. The Protestant Reformation, which swept through Europe in the 16th century, came to Norway as a Danish import. In 1537, the Danish king, Christian Roman III, declared Denmark, Norway, a Lutheran state. The Catholic Church was dissolved, its properties were seized, monasteries were closed, bishops were replaced with Lutheran superintendents loyal to the crown. For ordinary Norwegians, this was a wrenching change imposed from above. Many people resisted, but resistance was futile. Norway had no independent political structure that could oppose Danish policy. The country was forcibly converted to Lutheranism at the command of a Danish king sitting in Copenhagen. What followed was nearly 3 centuries of Danish rule, a period Norwegians would later call the 400-year night. It's called that for a reason. Norwegian identity didn't disappear, but it was suppressed. Danish became the language of government, education, and culture. Norwegian dialects were considered peasant speech. If you wanted to get ahead, you learned Danish, adopted Danish customs, identified with Danish culture. The Norwegian nobility, never very powerful, was absorbed into the Danish aristocracy or simply disappeared. The church was controlled from Copenhagen. Trade was regulated for Danish benefit. But here's the interesting thing. Even during this long period of subordination, something distinctly Norwegian persisted, especially in the countryside. The farmers, fishermen, and craftspeople who made up the vast majority of the population continued to speak Norwegian dialects, maintain traditional customs, tell old stories. They had their own culture that existed parallel to the official Danish culture of the cities and the elite. This folk culture would become incredibly important later, when Norwegians started to rediscover their national identity. The Danish period wasn't entirely negative. Bergen became a major trading center in the Hanseatic League network, bringing wealth and connections to continental Europe. The economy grew. The population slowly recovered from the Black Death, though it never reached medieval levels. New technologies, new crops, new ideas filtered in. Norway was connected to the broader European world, even if it was through Danish intermediaries. But the key point is that Norwegians themselves had almost no say in their own governance. They were subjects, not citizens. The decisions that shaped their lives were made by foreigners. This situation finally began to change because of events far beyond Norway's control. In 1814, Denmark had been on the losing side of the Napoleonic Wars. As punishment, the great powers forced Denmark to give up Norway. But instead of independence, Norway was handed to Sweden. The Norwegians were furious. They'd had enough of being traded between kingdoms like property. On May 17, 1814, a constituent assembly met at Eidsvoll and wrote a constitution declaring Norway an independent kingdom. It was one of the most progressive constitutions in Europe at the time, inspired by the American and French revolutions, guaranteeing individual rights and establishing a democratic parliament. Sweden wasn't going to let Norway go that easily. The Swedish king, Charles Roman XIV John, invaded with an army, but he was smart enough to recognize that the Norwegians wouldn't accept simple conquest. A compromise was reached. Norway would enter into a personal union with Sweden, sharing a king but maintaining its own constitution, parliament, and domestic governance. It wasn't full independence, but it was a huge step forward. The Norwegians finally had control over their own internal affairs. The 19th century was a period of national awakening. Norwegian writers, artists, and intellectuals began deliberately constructing a Norwegian national identity distinct from Danish culture. They collected folk tales and folk songs. They studied Norwegian dialects and history. They wrote poetry and plays celebrating Norwegian landscapes and Norwegian heroes. Romantic nationalism was sweeping Europe, and Norway caught the fever. Figures like playwright Henrik Ibsen, composer Edvard Grieg, and painter Edvard Munch created art that was distinctly Norwegian but also world-class, proving that Norwegian culture could stand alongside any in Europe. This cultural nationalism was accompanied by political nationalism. Norwegians increasingly chafed under the union with Sweden. They wanted full independence, complete sovereignty. The union had been useful when Norway was weak and vulnerable, but by the late 19th century, Norway was strong enough to stand on its own. The economy was growing. Shipping, fishing, and eventually hydroelectric power made Norway prosperous. The population was educated, politically engaged, and ready for independence. The crisis came in 1905. The Norwegian Parliament passed a law giving Norway its own consular service, separate from Sweden's. The Swedish king refused to sign it. The Norwegian government resigned. The king said he couldn't form a new government. The Norwegian Parliament took this as an abdication of the Norwegian crown and declared the union dissolved. It was a constitutional coup, technically legal but politically explosive. Sweden mobilized for war. For a few tense months, it looked like Scandinavia might tear itself apart in warfare. But cooler heads prevailed. Sweden realized that conquering Norway would be expensive, bloody, and might invite interference from other European powers. Norway held a plebiscite where an overwhelming majority voted for independence. Sweden reluctantly agreed to dissolve the union. On October 26, 1905, the Swedish king renounced his claim to the Norwegian throne. Norway was finally, fully, independent for the first time in over 500 years. The newly independent Norway faced a choice. Would they be a republic or a monarchy? After much debate, they chose monarchy, but a constitutional monarchy with real democratic power resting in Parliament. They invited a Danish prince to become king, and he accepted, taking the name Håkon Roman VII, and his son's name was changed to Olaf. It was a symbolic link to Norway's medieval kings, to Saint Olaf and the glory days of independence. The early 20th century was a time of optimism and progress. Norway developed rapidly. Oslo grew into a modern capital. Hydroelectric dams harnessed Norway's abundant water resources. Norwegian shipping companies built fleets that sailed the world's oceans. Social reforms improved education, expanded voting rights, and created the beginnings of the welfare state. Norway even led in women's rights. Norwegian women got the vote in 1913, years before women in many other countries. Then came the World Wars. In the First World War, Norway remained neutral, though Norwegian shipping suffered heavy losses from submarine warfare. The Second World War was different. On April 9, 1940, Nazi Germany invaded Norway. The attack was a complete surprise. German warships appeared in Norwegian harbors. Paratroopers seized airfields. The Norwegian military was overwhelmed. Oslo fell in a day. The government fled north, fighting delaying actions, trying to organize resistance. King Håkon refused German demands to appoint a puppet government, fleeing eventually to England, where he became a symbol of Norwegian resistance. The Norwegian campaign was one of the few early German operations that didn't go entirely according to plan. Norwegian and Allied forces fought for 2 months before being evacuated, but ultimately Norway was occupied. For the next 5 years, Norwegians lived under Nazi rule, a puppet government led by Vidkun Quisling, whose name became synonymous with traitor, tried to Nazify Norwegian society. Most Norwegians resisted, sometimes passively, sometimes actively. Teachers refused to join Nazi organizations. Clergy opposed from their pulpits. Resistance fighters sabotaged German operations, most famously destroying the heavy water plant at Vemork, crucial to Nazi atomic research. The occupation was brutal. Thousands of Norwegians were arrested, tortured, executed. Nearly all of Norway's Jewish population, about 2,000 people, were deported to death camps. Only a few hundred survived. The country was looted, its resources shipped to Germany. By the time liberation came in May 1945, Norway was exhausted, impoverished, and traumatized. But Norway rebuilt quickly. The post-war years saw rapid economic development, funded partly by Marshall Plan aid. The country joined NATO in 1949, abandoning its traditional neutrality in favor of alignment with the West. The welfare state was expanded dramatically, creating the system of universal health care, free education, and generous social benefits that Norway is famous for today. Labor unions and social democratic parties dominated politics, creating a consensus around the idea that economic growth should benefit everyone, not just the wealthy. Then in 1969, everything changed again. Oil was discovered in the North Sea. At first, nobody was sure if there was enough oil to matter, but as exploration continued, it became clear that Norway had hit the jackpot. The oil reserves were massive. Norway went from a moderately prosperous country to one of the richest nations on Earth. The petroleum industry transformed the economy, bringing unprecedented wealth. But here's the remarkable thing. Norway didn't squander its oil wealth. The government established the Government Pension Fund Global, often called the Oil Fund, investing petroleum revenues for future generations. Instead of spending all the money immediately, they saved and invested it. Today, that fund is worth over $1 trillion, making it the world's largest sovereign wealth fund. Every Norwegian citizen is, in effect, a millionaire when you divide the fund by population. This wealth has allowed Norway to build one of the world's most comprehensive welfare states. Healthcare is free, education is free through university, parents get generous parental leave, unemployment benefits are substantial, the government invests heavily in infrastructure, culture, and environmental protection. Income inequality is among the lowest in the world. By almost any measure, quality of life, happiness, human development, economic security, Norway consistently ranks at or near the top globally. But it hasn't all been smooth sailing. Norway has twice voted against joining the European Union in 1972 and 1994. Norwegians wanted to maintain their sovereignty and control over their resources, especially fishing and oil. They are part of the European Economic Area, giving them access to EU markets without full membership. But it's a complex arrangement that continues to generate debate. Immigration has become a contentious political issue, as it has across Europe. A far-right populist party has gained support by opposing immigration and multiculturalism. The question of how Norway maintains its generous welfare state while integrating newcomers is an ongoing challenge. Climate change poses another dilemma. Norway's wealth comes from oil, but Norwegians are among the world's most environmentally conscious people. They're leaders in electric vehicle adoption, renewable energy, and environmental protection. But they're also major oil exporters. There's a fundamental contradiction there that Norway is still trying to resolve. Can you be a climate leader while profiting from fossil fuels? Norway's government argues yes, that they're producing oil as cleanly as possible and using the revenues to fund the transition to a green economy. Critics say it's hypocrisy. So where does that leave us? What's the hidden history of Norway really about? I think it's about resilience and adaptation. It's about a people who survived in one of Earth's harshest environments, and not just survived but thrived. It's about how geography shapes destiny, How those deep fjords and mountain valleys created a fragmented political landscape that took centuries to unify. It's about the tension between independence and cooperation, between isolation and connection to the wider world. Norway's story is also about identity. What does it mean to be Norwegian? Is it about Viking heritage, Christian faith, the long struggle for independence, the language debates and cultural nationalism of the 19th century? The resistance to Nazi occupation, the oil wealth and welfare state of today? The answer is all of these and more. Norwegian identity, like any national identity, is constructed and contested. A story that each generation tells itself about who they are and where they came from. What strikes me most about Norwegian history is how recent so much of it is. Norwegian independence is only 120 years old. Living Norwegians remember when their country was poor, when people emigrated by the hundreds of thousands to America, seeking better opportunities. The transformation from poverty to prosperity happened within living memory. The oil era is only 50 years old. Norway, as we know it today, this wealthy, progressive, peaceful nation, is a very recent creation. And yet, there are continuities that stretch back centuries. The love of nature, the connection to the sea, the value placed on equality and community, these aren't new. They're deeply rooted in Norwegian culture, visible in the medieval law codes, in the folk traditions, in the way Norwegian society has been organized for generations. Modern Norway didn't come from nowhere. It's built on foundations laid over centuries. I think that's what makes Norway's story so fascinating. It's not a simple narrative of progress or decline. It's complicated. There are periods of greatness and periods of subordination. Times of expansion and times of isolation. Moments of proud independence and centuries of foreign rule. But through it all, there's a thread of continuity. A Norwegian identity that persisted even when Norway itself almost disappeared as a political entity. Today, Norway faces new challenges. How do you maintain a generous welfare state in a globalized economy? How do you integrate immigrants while preserving social cohesion? How do you transition from oil wealth to sustainable prosperity? How do you maintain independence and sovereignty in an interconnected world? These are the questions Norway is grappling with now, and the answers aren't obvious. But if history teaches us anything, it's that Norwegians are good at adaptation. They've survived ice ages and plagues, Viking raids and world wars, poverty and foreign domination. They've built, lost, and rebuilt their country multiple times. They've taken the wealth from oil, something that has cursed many nations with corruption and inequality, and used it to create one of the world's most successful societies. That takes wisdom, discipline, and a commitment to the common good that's rare in human history. The hidden history of Norway, the real story beneath the Viking myths and the tourist brochures, is about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. It's about farmers who became warriors, warriors who became explorers, explorers who became settlers. It's about communities that survived isolation and hardship through cooperation and mutual support. It's about a country that refused to disappear even when more powerful neighbors tried to absorb it. It's about transformation from pagan to Christian, from scattered clans to unified kingdom, from Danish province to Swedish partner to fully independent nation, from poverty to prosperity. And maybe that's the lesson we can take from Norway's story. Nations aren't fixed. They're always changing, always adapting to new circumstances. The choices made by each generation shape the country their children will inherit. Norwegians chose to save their oil wealth rather than spend it. They chose extensive social welfare over low taxes. They chose equality over hierarchy. Those choices weren't inevitable. They were deliberate, made by people who thought about what kind of society they wanted to build. So the next time you hear about Norway, don't just think of Vikings and fjords. Think about the whole long, complex, fascinating story of how a frozen kingdom on the edge of the world became one of the most successful nations on earth. Think about the struggles and the triumphs, the defeats and the victories. the centuries of patience and the moments of decisive action. That's the hidden history of Norway, and it's a story that's still being written today. If you found this journey through Norwegian history as fascinating as I did, do me a favor and